Unto the Hills by Margaret Walker Freel. Chapter 32. Margaret was pleased to see Pitt, at last, happily married and settled into his own home in a little log house below Tatham's mill. She volunteered young Anne's services to Sally, since they were close enough for Anne to continue sleeping in the slaves' quarters behind the inn. Having just succeeded in getting one new daughter settled into the family, Margaret was not quite prepared for the news that Rufus brought in so soon on the heels of Pitt's marriage to Sally Johnson. Rufus was waving a letter as he called to Margaret. "Here's a letter from George. See what he has to say." Margaret mused aloud as she skimmed over the contents of the letter. "There's good news. He's well satisfied, and the store's going fine. He's boarding with Bill and Angie Mauney." Margaret paused. "Go on," urged Ruth. "What's the matter?" "Nothing," said Margaret. "It's just that he's getting girls on his mind. Says here that there are pretty girls over there. He mentioned John Barker's girl, Maddie, who's going to East Tennessee to college." "Oh, don't get upset about the girl talk, Mother. George is sure old enough to have a girl." "I guess you're right, Ruth. I hope he finds a good one." As they were discussing George's letter, Pitt came in. He had been on one of his mule trading trips down into Georgia. "How'd you do with your trading this time, Pitt?" asked Margaret. "Fine, Ma. I think I'm going to let Ruth look after the store here all the time. I can make more money trading than in the store." "I see you have a newspaper with you. Where is it from?" "Oh, that's our county paper. I stopped in Murphy as I came through. I heard they were publishing one, so I subscribed to it. It's called the Cherokee Herald." Margaret sat with Laura's letter in her lap. Her younger sister, who had gone to the city to work, had written that she was getting married. Margaret wasn't surprised. Laura was the beauty of the family, and they knew it wouldn't be long before she married. Her thoughts were interrupted by Pitt's hasty entrance. "Hey, Ma," he called. "I'm a father. It's a boy." His pride was evident in his broad smile. Margaret was delighted. "Oh, Pitt, I'm so happy. How is Sally, and what are you going to name him?" "John William. That's for both our fathers, you know." "Also your grandfather," reminded Margaret. "When will you be able to bring them home? I do so want to see my first grandson. I want to hold him in my arms. I've never seen Agnew's little girl, but this baby will live close by, and I can watch him grow." "I'll bring them home soon. Sally wants to stay a while with her mother until she learns how to manage." After allowing Margaret time to absorb the fact that she was once again a grandmother, Pitt changed the subject to his brother McLean. "What about McLean?" asked Margaret. "He wrote asking my advice and help. Seems he isn't happy in Texas. Says he never has taken to it. I don't know whether he's still just homesick or that isn't just a good place for him. He wants to come home, but is kind of ashamed. He's afraid we will think he's a quitter. I think he wants us to tell him to come home. I wrote him today to come home and take over the store here. I'm going to send Ruth over to Hayesville to run a store over there. What do you think about that, Ma?" Margaret smiled. "Nothing would please me more than to have all my boys close to home. Of course it's a good idea. I hadn't thought of Ruth's leaving home just yet. He's the only one left here with me, but Hayesville isn't far away, and McLean will live here until he decides to get married." Margaret's voice stopped, but her mind continued to picture the happy possibility of having one more of her sons back under her roof. McLean didn't need a second invitation. He came home immediately upon receipt of Pitt's letter and took over the trading post. He was appointed postmaster, and Ruth went off to Hayesville to run the store there. Margaret had become accustomed to her sons barging in with unexpected announcements as to their plans for their future. So though she had not expected him, she was not surprised when George suddenly appeared on a Saturday night with the announcement that he had been requested to go to Raleigh as the first representative from Graham County. My, this is an honor. Margaret was proud of her son. Then she asked, "And what will you do about the store?" "Well, that's what I want to talk with you and the other boys about," replied George. I wonder if Pitt might not be willing to go to Robbinsville and run the store for the periods of time that I'll have to be in Raleigh." They turned to Pitt, who remained silent for a time. Then he said, "Well, I remember Pa used to say it helped your business to dabble a little in politics. But, George, I'm sort of surprised. You're mighty young, and you haven't been over there very long. I'm surprised they didn't pick one of the old-timers. But I'm glad they picked you." He, too, was proud of his brother. "Sure, I'll come over and run the store while you're gone." Quiet McLean spoke up. "I think this is fine, George. I'm proud of you. Go into politics and become a senator someday." After the other boys had gone to bed, Margaret and George sat talking. Margaret said, "George, I do want you to know how happy and proud we are of you. I'm glad you're going to Raleigh. I've always known that of all my boys, you are more like your father. You are a good salesman in the store, but most of all, you have executive ability and a legal mind. You'll be a leader among men." George chuckled. "You sound like a mother talking, but thank you. If I'm a little bit like Father, I'm glad. Also, I'm happy you are willing to accept responsibilities for your community and county. It's good that things are becoming normal again. At last people are beginning to forget the hatreds and bickering of the war days. America now means all of us. Human beings realize they must band together for the common good, and that the common good is right, justice, and liberty. We have duties and obligations to perform in return for the blessings we enjoy. We must always be aware that we have a sacred trust attached to the rich heritage given to us by our forebears. We must never forget that we have our personal responsibility to the extent of our ability. We have to work for civil and religious liberty. It is only through moral government that a man can be happy. George Washington said, "Virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government." Today, we need not win glory in wars as our ancestor did, nor do we any longer have to found new countries. Our fathers did that for us. It's now our privilege and duty to work together for brotherhood and peace. We must make this an age of improvement and development in our land. We must strive to leave something behind, that our day and generation will have something worthy to be remembered for. We must cultivate union and harmony. Let our efforts be such that our village, our county, our state, and our nations will be one in wisdom, peace, and liberty. Gracious, George, I've preached a sermon. It's after midnight. We, too, must go to bed. Good night, and God bless you in your work, my son. Your father would be proud of you." On Sunday, Rufus came over from Hayesville. Margaret almost wept for joy. "Oh, how wonderful to have my 4 boys home together. As the Bible says, my cup runneth over. It would be complete if only Agnew were here." Then she whispered to herself, "And if Billy were here." Margaret's days became busier as the inn became the meeting place of many of the railroad men and other businessmen intent on moving transportation and industry west. Time was hurrying along, though Margaret hardly took notice of the fact. When Margaret became aware that McLean had followed her into her bedroom, she asked immediately, "Out with it, McLean. What's on your mind?" McLean laughed sheepishly. "Now, Mother, how did you know there was something on my mind?" "Don't I know, my boys? I can always tell when you have something to discuss, so what is it?" "Mother, do you remember that girl George wrote us about who was going to college in Tennessee? He talked about how pretty she was." "Oh, yes, that was John Barker's girl. He's the one with the carding machine. He's been carding our wool for us. He also has a turning lathe and makes furniture. I believe George said her name was Martha. Why do you ask?" "Well, I thought that was her name. And George has good taste, I'd say. She sure is a pretty girl." "What are you talking about? When have you seen her?" "Oh, she came into the store today and bought a spool of thread. She was a little shy, but we got to talking." "Why did she come all the way over here from Robbinsville to buy a spool of thread?" "Oh, she didn't just come to buy a spool of thread. She's our new school teacher and is boarding with Hugh and Mary Collett." Well, what did you think of her? Do you think George was serious about her? All I know is she's pretty and seems real smart. She's tall and slender. Her eyes are blue and her hair is golden brown and curly. If George is serious about her, I think she'd be fine for him. Margaret smiled at McLean's evaluation of the girl. Well, I'm glad you approve of her. I've heard some nice things said about the new teacher. Little Richard Collett was bragging about her, and his mother said that she liked her, but not realizing who she was, I didn't pay any attention to the name. In fact, I never dreamed it was anybody I'd ever heard of before. I'm anxious to meet her, and I'm glad that we can see her. Pitt returned home when George was returned to Robbinsville after serving in the House of Representatives in Raleigh. It wasn't long before George sent word to his mother that she would have another daughter-in-law. Margaret accepted the news happily. This was the first one of her sons to marry a girl she had met. The pretty young teacher had been successful at her job as teacher in the old Valley Town school and was well liked by the community. So on Sunday, October 16, 1884, George brought his brand new bride to Walker Inn to meet his family. The family greeted the arrivals on the wide veranda. Margaret drew the timid bride to her bosom and kissed her, saying, "Welcome to our family, and Walker Inn, Martha. We wish you and George much happiness." Martha accepted the warm greetings and shyly remarked that though her name was Martha, she was familiarly called Mattie, and she hoped that the family would think of her by that name. Since none of George's family had attended the wedding, Mattie described it in detail as they were eating the delicious meal that had been prepared for them. When Rufus came home from Hayesville, Margaret was prepared for whatever news he might have brought. But she greeted him with her news first. George and Mattie have a little girl, and they have named her Kathleen. Rufus' countenance showed his pleasure at becoming an uncle for the third time. However, he suggested, Pitt is probably crowing about having the only boy up to now. Then she changed the subject. "How's Grandma, Scott? You wrote she was pretty sick." "Yes, Rufe, your grandmother is mighty sick. She won't ever be well again, I fear. She won't be with us much longer. She's been suffering a great deal lately. You best go by there while you're here this time." "Oh, I will. Now, let me tell you my news. I'm getting hitched, and I wanted to tell you first. I want you to know about it before we get married." "Oh, I'm glad." Margaret was pleased at Rufe's thoughtfulness of her. "Who's the girl?" "Her name is Fanny Lyons, and she's Becky Allison's sister. You know, I've been boarding with Sam and Becky Allison. Fanny's folks are dead, and she lives with them also." Margaret smiled fondly at her youngest son. "Well, thank you for coming to me, Rufe. I do hope you and Fanny will be happy. Please bring her here for me to meet as soon as you can." Only a few short weeks later, Mary Scott passed away. And though Margaret sorely missed her mother, she felt some comfort in the knowledge that her mother was no longer in pain, for she had suffered much during the last years of her life. Chapter 33. Margaret had the entire household in a strut. They were preparing for Agnew and his family's first visit back home. As she worked and directed the work of the others, Margaret happily remembered the days of his childhood. How young she was when he was born, and how much he had meant to her and Billy. This was too happy a time to dwell on the sorrow and sufferings that had been intermingled with the pleasure and happiness of raising this, her firstborn, into adulthood, only to watch him go off to fight in the war between the states, and then to return only to leave again. Now, 20 years later, he was returning home with his wife and young daughter. He was a successful businessman. Both his wife and daughters were gifted musicians. Agnew was now vice president of the Citizens Bank of Wichita, the largest bank in Kansas. Margaret's joy was unsurpassed when, on the night of Agnew's arrival, all the other boys and their families came, and for the first time in almost a quarter of a century, Margaret had her entire family surrounding her. Ah, the happiness! How she listened as each of her sons told of their lives, their many accomplishments and their plans. All the boys were interested in each other and took pride in everything each had done. There was no feeling of jealousy or competition among the boys. As the boys had always looked up to Agnew because he was the oldest, and they turned to him now, each taking pleasure in hearing all that had occurred during his years away from the family hearth. They were particularly proud to hear Agnew's recital of his trip to Washington. It was a wonderful and pleasant experience, meeting the President of the United States personally. He was very courteous to me and invited me to his house. Grover Cleveland is a good man. I think he's making a fine president, and I hope he will be reelected. You mean you really saw the President of the United States and the White House and all? Said one of the boys in awe. Yes, I saw him at the White House. It is a beautiful house. Of course, I also went to the Capitol building. It is certainly a building for America to be proud of. I looked up your congressman. He seemed glad to see someone from North Carolina. And so cruel time would not stop for Margaret to have her family with her always. It pushed on, and early Monday morning the boys had to go their separate ways to open their stores and once again assume the responsibilities of adulthood. It was amid promises of returning again soon that Agnew and his family were readying their departure. The entire family were assembled to await the stagecoach. Young Elvie said shyly, "Grandmother, I just loved your little flax wheel. Could I have it some day?" "Bless your heart, Elvie, of course you may have it. I noticed you playing with it while you were here. You won't ever need it again, I hope." Turning to Agnew, she continued, "Agnew, I've enjoyed your visit so much. I'm so glad you came and brought Arda and Elvie. I had hoped and prayed so long, and I had almost given up. Arda is a wonderful woman, and Elvie a fine young girl. And Agnew, I want you to know I am proud of you. How I wish your father could have been here to see you and your family and all of his sons together. I'm proud of them all." "Now, Mother," admonished Agnew, "if you're not careful, you'll end up crying." The stagecoach arrived, and Agnew and his family were carried away from Margaret. She stood there with Pitt, McLean, and the blacks as they silently watched the coach wend its way up Junaluska. Little Elvie's sweet face could be seen as she leaned out and waved frantic farewells. As Margaret continued her busy life, her family grew. George had written that he and Martha had a son, and they had named him William Barker. Margaret was overjoyed that George had named his son for his father. Then, too, it was sweet to remember Mattie's maiden name. Hardly was her rejoicing over than a letter arrived from Rufus in Hayesville which said, "We have a little girl, born today. We have named her Marvy." Margaret was indeed happy. Now 4 of her boys were married and had families. She still had McLean with her. Of course, she wanted him to marry and have a family too. McLean was her gentlest one, and she would miss him terribly. He'd never been strong because of his asthma. Margaret realized that she would not always be with him and that he would never need a woman who would help to take care of him. As these thoughts were going through her mind, McLean himself appeared at the door. "McLean, I was just thinking about you. All the other boys are married and have children. What about you? Aren't you going to get married? Ruth and George are both younger than you." "Why, Mother," teased McLean, "I'm surprised. Want to get rid of me? Here I was thinking you wanted at least one boy left at home." "Oh, stop teasing. Of course I want you at home with me, but I want you to marry and have a family like the other boys," McLean continued in his teasing manner. "Of course, I'll get married when I get old enough." "Old enough, my foot," responded Margaret. "You're 39 years old. How old do you think you have to be?" Margaret snorted. "McLean, you used to like the Mundy girl, and you went and let her marry someone else." Again, acting as if serious, McLean answered, "Well, Mother, I've always had this nasty old asthma, and I never have been as hefty as your other sons. I sort of figured no other woman would love me enough to wait on me like you have." "McLean, be serious. You always make a joke of things. Remember, I won't always be here. I'm getting on in years. I would really be happy if you could just find a good woman to love you. What about Ben Adams' little girl? What made you lose interest there?" McLean's face reddened. "Oh, she went off to school. She went to John Marshall Cobb's school in Bellevue. Now, she has gone to Young Harris College in North Georgia. She's interested in getting educated, not getting married." "You didn't answer my question. What happened?" "Well," said McLean, "she came into the store one day and I went up to ask her what she wanted and she said nothing. Then she kept on hanging around. Judd Bristol, who helps me some in the store, went up and asked her and she said what she wanted and bought it. I just don't think she liked to talk to me, and I didn't like the way she acted." Margaret laughed. "Why, McLean, you're acting childish and silly." "Well, I thought she was mighty childish or something to act that way." "I believe Julia is really shy. Remember, she's a lot younger than you. She's always been shy. She probably liked you, but being timid, she didn't know what to say. If I were you, I'd try again." "You may be right," admitted McLean. "Next time she comes in, I'll see if she'll buy something from me now." Margaret and McLean continued their discussion of McLean's future, but, of course, no decisions were made that evening. The family continued to grow and prosper. George and Ruth both made announcements of additions to their families almost at the same time. When Ruth began having a little difficulty running the store in Hayesville, Pitt suggested that McLean go over and assist him. This was done. Pitt continued to purchase the land and to build upon it. On the day Pitt moved into his new store and new home, McLean arrived to tell Margaret that Ruth had taken seriously ill. McLean and Margaret hastened to Hayesville in time for Rufus to see his mother and request that she look out for his family. And then he died. They carried him across Old Road Gap to Old Valleytown Graveyard and laid him to rest. His young wife and 2 children went to live with and be cared for by Margaret. Following Ruth's death, McLean remained in Hayesville and continued to operate the store. One day, he made an unexpected visit home. Margaret, of course, was greatly pleased. "Why, McLean, whatever brought you home? I wasn't expecting you." There was a twinkle in his eye as he answered, "Mother, that Adams girl has decided to buy a spool of thread from me, so I decided to get over my mad spell and sell it to her. I told her I'd sell her something if she would cook for me to pay for it. She says she's willing to make that kind of bargain." Margaret was aghast. "Why, McLean, hush your foolishness. Do you mean to tell me you're going to get married at last?" "Yes, Mother, I really am in earnest. Julia and I are getting married tomorrow, and Steve Porter is going to marry us. I've just asked Pitt's boy, John, and Croft Watson to act as witnesses." With happy tears in her eyes, Margaret drew McLean into her arms. "Forgive me for crying, McLean, but I'm so happy for you. Now all of my boys are married. Julia is a fine, sweet girl. I will love her as I love you." That night, as she read her Bible, Margaret again had time to reminisce over her life. Yes, there had been good times, and there had been bad, but the good times outweighed the bad. At least, they were easier to remember. Remember. She'd forgotten to read the letter that had arrived about the time McLean brought his news. She opened it. Here was another letter from George. He and Maddie had their 3rd little girl, their 5th child. This little girl they named Margaret. A smile crossed Margaret's face. Here she had reached her allotted 60 years and 10, and now there was another Margaret Walker just starting out on her promised equal allotment. Margaret closed her eyes in contentment as she leaned her head back and dozed into a peaceful reverie of quietude. Epilogue. Good friend, time is fleeting. My tale is told, my message endeth. History hath written, in the beginning God. Yea, have you not heard, that it hath been said, Jesus Christ the same, yesterday and today and forever? Whatever the yesterday, whatever our today, tomorrow cometh, tomorrow a new day. Where mankind travelleth from darkness to light eternal, today teacheth mankind, yea, a teacher greater than history. The Prince of Peace hath spoken, love thy neighbor as thyself. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give unto you. Set thine house in order. Dear readers, I will not leave you wondering about the fate of Squire William Billy Walker. In spite of many letters written and questions asked, Margaret Walker was unable to get any information concerning his whereabouts, or whether he had been killed as the soldiers had threatened, or whether he had been imprisoned. Margaret died in 1899 without ever having heard from him again. However, the family continued to search, and some years later, a letter from the Adjutant General's office in Washington, D.C. stated as follows: with the best information that it appears from our records of this office, that William Walker, a citizen of North Carolina, captured near Atlanta, Georgia, July 19, 1864, died at Camp Douglas, Illinois, November 30th, 1864, of remittent fever, and is buried in grave 181, Block 2, Chicago City Cemetery, Chicago, Illinois. Margaret Scott Walker's life from her birth in Pennsylvania on March 15, 1820, until her death in Cherokee County, North Carolina on December 8, 1889, at the age of 79 years, is told within this book. Her last 34 years were faced courageously alone. She had no longer had Billy to lean on. The Yankee raiders had left her home in shambles, and the war had left her financially destitute. But she faced these adversities with courage and faith in God, and lived out her life as an example for others to follow. She passed on to her children and her grandchildren a message of courage and a philosophy of life that bears repeating. As an old woman, she sits thinking about youth. Ah, youth, glorious, fleeting, yet unwanted by the possessor. It is a wonderful thing, filled with magical joy, here today and gone tomorrow, fragile and intangible as softly fallen snow. O envied youth, with its dreams and rainbow visions, happy springtime of life, passionate young lovers, divine, enchanted, careless youth, perceived not by the golden moments until they are vanished. Precious yesterdays so carelessly tossed away. O lost moments of ecstasy! Would that youth might be eternal. Glorious dreams drifted on and on with hopes and ambitions of the aged for the youth, the picture of man's struggle never ending, for his desired freedom and peace. Liberty, in the beginning God, according to God's plan, a man came forth. Each mortal has his moment and his day. Each soul emerges for his flame. Each being has his place and his mission. God raised up Moses to deliver his chosen people from the slavery and bondage of Pharaoh, and to lead them to freedom and the promised land. The Almighty spoke through Isaiah his prophet to foretell his children the coming of his Son, to deliver the peoples of the earth from the bondage of sin. To Solomon, the man who chose wisdom, God entrusted the building of his holy temple. Then came a voice crying in the wilderness. John the Baptist lived to give the world the news of the advent of a Savior. Using human hands to bring about his plan, the ruler of the universe sent his Son into the world that mankind might be saved from sin and have eternal life. The early church was given Saul, who later became Paul, to heed the call to go over into Macedonia and preach the gospel message to all then the known world. Constantine the Great lived to free the world of paganism and bring freedom to Christians. Martin Luther came to drive the nails at Wittenberg, bring the Reformation and freedom. John Wesley was born to bring the Christian message to the New World. A glimpse of heaven was brought to mortals when Charles Wesley gave birth to "A mighty fortress is our God, his kingdom is forever." The rugged Abraham Lincoln lived to emancipate the black man from human bondage. To humanity was given the immortal tongue of Henry Grady, the imperishable pens of Byron, Whitman, Sandburg, and Wolfe with messages of liberty. In time of tribulation, God raised up the statesman Woodrow Wilson to bring the foundations for a structure for world brotherhood and freedom from oppression. Out of the travail of 2 wars emerged the heritage of the 4 freedoms and the immortal words, blood, sweat, and tears. In grand climax, the earth gave birth to, we the people of the United States determined to save the succeeding generations from the scourge of war, to affirm faith in human rights, the worth of the human person, to practice tolerance, and to live together in peace as good neighbors. God loves the little peoples of the earth. To those he entrusted the transformation of the wilderness of the New World into a free nation. America was born great. Its foundations were built on freedom, liberty, and God. A little girl was born in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. As a babe, she was whisked to the wilds of the Appalachian region. To Margaret Scott was given the ambition to leave something behind and never to bring shame to the ancestral name. She lived to become a light to the hill country. She was born to give faith in brotherly love. She had 5 sons. This woman existed to hand the torch to another wee babe, her little namesake. Again, dear reader, minutes, hours, days, years, centuries slip silently into the leaves of history. Time, the impatient, relentless master of man's destiny, tells of the intervals of the yesterdays, todays, and tomorrows. Will history inscribe the revelry of today as surpassing in sum total all that has gone before? Today, the age of wondrous creation, yet, too, the age of violence. Earth teeters on the abyss of a new day, a new age. What of tomorrow? Will history inscribe blackness and gloom? Will time, the narrator, chronicle an age of gladness and brotherhood? What will be written on the book of tomorrow? Shall it be softness and glittering living, music and wine, shaded lights, jewels and dancing, moonlight and embracing, clinging lips, revelry by night? Will there be figure flaunting, giddy laughter, sex, debauchery with man no higher than beast? Will tomorrow be one of palm greasing, tarnished statesmen, political stench, and disintegration of governments? What of liberty and justice? Will writers record an age of hopeless struggle against bondage and servitude, tyranny, selfishness, and greed? Shall there be another dark age? Is there to be again wars and rumors of wars? Will the earth writhe in a final and terrifying holocaust, Armageddon, and utter destruction by man's own hand? Will the peoples of tomorrow turn back the leaves of history and follow in the footsteps of Lincoln, Wilson, Churchill, and the great Prince of Peace? Or will mankind worship the god of greed, as Napoleon and Stalin, and attempt to hold the whole world in their hands? Humanity stands at what may be the beginning of his last tomorrow. This is my prayer. Almighty God, snatch from frail mankind the bauble, the tinsel, and the glitter. Grant to thy children the vision of simple things, the spirit of thankfulness for raindrops, sunshine, and the pure white snowflake. Give again the dream to know appreciation for everyday things, love, hope, and the faith of our fathers. To love music, to see beauty, the majestic grandeur of the eternal hills. Again, give man the chance to share, to live and to let live, the common sense and willingness to give and take, to appreciate the right to friendly differences. Above all, thankfulness for a loving and forgiving God, and for the privilege of prayer. In Panorama, it has been unfolded the story of mankind. The saga of man's struggle for liberty has been written. Each age, a dream that is dying of one that is coming to birth. As mankind stands on what may be the beginning of his last tomorrow, he must, O Lord, guard liberty and freedom with prayer. He must remember the world is small and round, that he is his brother's keeper. He must know that only ones with clean hands and pure hearts can be free to inherit the earth. Through the many yesterdays of history, The first pages were written in the Middle East. Is the world now witnessing the shuffling on the stage of the last great drama? Is time assembling the last tomorrow for the final pages of history? Through Isaiah, God spoke to King Hezekiah, "Set thine house in order, for thou shalt die." Is mankind now close to the final cataclysmic battle predicted by prophets of old? Mortals of today can view the Toa, the river. He can and must guide its course. Oh, that thou hast hearkened to my commandments! Then had thy peace been as a river, and thy righteousness as waves of the sea. When the curtain is lifted for the final tomorrow, when the Toa shall have reached the terminus, God grant that mortals will follow the footsteps of the Prince of Peace. Grant that, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks, and nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. End of Unto the Hills by Margaret Walker Freel.